What if the emergency pantry you spent months carefully building could completely fail you the moment you actually need it? Not because the food is missing, not because you didn't plan, but because of a quiet assumption buried inside almost every home pantry in the world. An assumption so subtle that most people never even notice it until it's too late. That assumption is this: that life will stay mostly normal. Your pantry assumes you have a working stove. It assumes you have running water. It assumes you have the physical energy and mental clarity to wash, soak, season, and cook raw ingredients from scratch. And here is the uncomfortable truth. The moment a real disruption hits, those assumptions collapse. And when they do, that carefully stocked shelf of rice, pasta, and canned beans stops being a lifeline and starts being a collection of things you cannot actually use. Today, we are going beyond the basics that every preparedness video already covers. We are talking about 12 specific, often overlooked items that address the gaps most pantries completely ignore: the sensory gaps, the physical gaps, the infrastructure gaps, and the psychological gaps. These are the items that determine whether your pantry simply survives on paper or actually functions when the world around you stops cooperating. Stay until the end, because the last item on this list is something almost everyone walks past at the grocery store without a second thought, and it might be the single most important thing missing from your shelf right now. Welcome to Essential Pantry. If this is your first time here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps us keep building this community and putting out content that actually matters. Let's start with something that almost no preparedness guide talks about honestly: the psychological dimension of a crisis. Most people plan for hunger. They count calories, they stack cans, they calculate how many days their supply will last. What they do not plan for is what happens to the human mind after day 3 of eating the same shelf-stable food out of the same bowl in the same dim kitchen. Here is what actually happens. By the end of the first week of a real disruption, the challenge stops being about survival and starts being about something far more subtle. It's called palate fatigue, and it is genuinely dangerous. When every meal has the same salt profile, the same texture, and the same visual presentation, the brain begins to lose its appetite signal. You are not hungry. You do not want to eat. And when the people in your household, especially children, stop wanting to eat, that is when the real crisis begins, because the calories sitting on your shelf stop making their way into the bodies that need them. This is where the first overlooked item comes in, and it is one of the oldest foods in human history: honey. Most people have honey in their kitchen, but almost nobody thinks of it as a preparedness essential. That is a mistake. Honey does several things that nothing else in your pantry can replicate. On a purely practical level, it provides fast energy from natural sugars, it requires zero preparation, and it essentially never expires. Archaeologists have found edible honey inside Egyptian tombs that are thousands of years old. There is no other food on Earth with that kind of shelf stability. But the real value of honey is not nutritional, it is psychological. By week 2 or 3 of a crisis, daily life can feel entirely mechanical. You eat to function, you sleep to recover, and you wake up and do it again. In that environment, a single spoonful of honey in warm water or tea does something remarkable. It is one of the most deeply conditioned comfort signals in human psychology. It tells every person in that household, on a level below conscious thought, that life has not been completely reduced to survival logistics. That small signal matters more than most people realize when morale is quietly eroding. Now, the second item addresses a different but equally serious problem. What happens when the appetite itself breaks down entirely? Miso paste. You'll usually find it in the refrigerated section of the grocery store, which is precisely why most people overlook it as a pantry item. But miso is a fermented product, and under proper storage conditions, it is remarkably shelf-stable. More importantly, it solves one of the most underappreciated problems in long-term food storage. When you dissolve a single spoonful of miso into hot water, you get something that rice and beans and pasta simply cannot produce on their own: a deep, savory, complex flavor profile known as umami. It is the taste of depth. It is the taste of a real meal. And for a brain that has been processing the same flat, repetitive sensory input for days on end, that umami signal is powerful enough to reset the appetite response almost immediately. People who were refusing to eat suddenly want to eat again. That is not a small thing. That is the difference between your family staying nourished and your family slowly falling behind on calories without even realizing it. The third item in this section is one that most people recognize but consistently underestimate: canned sardines. Tuna is the fish most people stock. Tuna is also the fish that disappears from store shelves within the first 24 hours of any panic buying event. Sardines, on the other hand, are almost always still there, and they are actually the superior option in almost every measurable way. A single small can of sardines contains complete protein, healthy fats, omega-3 fatty acids, and calcium in a format that requires absolutely no heat, no water, and it essentially never expires. Archaeologists have found edible honey inside Egyptian tombs that are thousands of years old. There is no other food on Earth with that kind of shelf stability. But the real value of honey is not nutritional, it is psychological. By week 2 or 3 of a crisis, daily life can feel entirely mechanical. You eat to function, you sleep to recover, and you wake up and do it again. In that environment, a single spoonful of honey in warm water or tea does something remarkable. It is one of the most deeply conditioned comfort signals in human psychology. It tells every person in that household, on a level below conscious thought, that life has not been completely reduced to survival logistics. That small signal matters more than most people realize when morale is quietly eroding.
When you are physically exhausted, when the power has been out for 2 days, and the thought of setting up a cooking situation feels overwhelming, that zero activation energy requirement is not a convenience. It is essential. Even the oil inside the can is a resource. It is concentrated caloric density that can be used to dress rice or crackers, adding fat and flavor to foods that desperately need both. Stock both varieties: oil-packed for high-calorie situations and water-packed for versatility. Now let us talk about what might be the most dangerous assumption hiding inside the average home pantry. Most pantries are planned as if the kitchen will always work. That assumption is so deeply embedded in how we think about food storage that most people never even examine it. You stock the rice, but you assume there will be water to boil it in. You stock the beans, but you assume there will be a flame to cook them over. You stock the frozen meat, but you assume the refrigerator will keep running. The moment any one of those assumptions fails, a significant portion of your stored food becomes functionally inaccessible. This is the infrastructure gap, and the first item that bridges it is one that is rarely included in any preparedness list: charcoal. Not a camping stove, not a propane setup, though those have their place. Simple charcoal and a basic grill. Here is why it matters so specifically. By day 2 of a power outage, your refrigerator transitions from an asset to a liability. Everything inside it is on a clock, and that clock is running down fast. Having a bag of charcoal means you have an independent heat source that requires no grid infrastructure whatsoever. You can boil water, you can cook through the contents of your freezer before it spoils, you can process those raw staples that are otherwise sitting uselessly on your shelf. Charcoal is not a comfort item. It is the item that determines whether the rest of your food storage has any functional value at all when the infrastructure fails. The next item addresses a quieter but equally important gap: protecting the financial value of the food you have already purchased. White vinegar. Most people think of vinegar as a flavor enhancer, a salad dressing ingredient, something you drizzle. In a preparedness context, it is primarily a preservation tool. When the vegetables in your refrigerator begin to soften, when the cucumbers start to go limp, when the carrots lose their snap, vinegar allows you to quick pickle them, extending their usable life by weeks. That is not a cooking technique. That is a financial decision. Every vegetable you preserve with vinegar is money you do not have to spend replacing it. In a long-term financial disruption, preventing waste is functionally equivalent to earning income. Beyond preservation, the acidity in vinegar does something almost magical to food that has been sitting flat and flavorless. It wakes it up. A splash of vinegar in a pot of beans, a dish of rice, or a pan of sautéed vegetables introduces a brightness that cuts through the monotony and makes the food taste intentional again. The fourth item deserves its own conversation because it is not just one meal, it's potentially dozens. Dried chickpeas. Most preparedness planning involves beans, and that is a reasonable choice. But chickpeas offer something that most other legumes do not, which is what we might call a creative ceiling, a range of possible outcomes that is wide enough to meaningfully combat the psychological exhaustion of eating the same thing night after night. You can simmer chickpeas into a hearty soup. You can mash them with oil and garlic into a rough hummus. You can roast them dry in a pan until they're crispy and use them as a topping or a snack. You can fold them into a stew, press them into patties, or simply season and serve them over rice in a dozen different ways. Each of those preparations feels and tastes like a different meal, even though the core ingredient is identical. That matters enormously over weeks and months of restricted eating because the sense that meals are varied and intentional is one of the key psychological anchors that keeps a household from sliding into despair. So far, we have talked about the sensory and infrastructural layers of preparedness. Now we need to talk about the one thing that is most often forgotten entirely: the physical body under sustained stress. Most people plan for hunger. Almost nobody plans for what a disruption actually does to the human body over time. When normalcy collapses, when you are suddenly carrying water instead of turning on a tap, hauling supplies instead of driving to a store, sleeping on a floor instead of a mattress, your body begins to experience a level of physical demand it has not encountered in years. Joints that rarely complained begin to ache. Energy that used to be reliable begins to disappear by early afternoon. And the diet you're eating, heavy in dry carbohydrates, light in everything else, is not built to support any of that. This is where two items that almost never appear on any preparedness list become genuinely critical. The first is unflavored gelatin. In normal daily life, we get collagen from fresh meats, bone broths, and animal products. These are exactly the foods that disappear first in a long-term disruption. When the diet shifts to dry staples, the body slowly loses access to the structural proteins that maintain joints, tendons, ligaments, and cartilage. That loss is invisible at first, but after 2 or 3 weeks of physical labor on a collagen-deficient diet, it starts to show up as deep joint pain, stiffness, and a kind of creaking exhaustion that does not respond to sleep. A packet of unflavored gelatin dissolved in warm water or stirred into food is one of the most compact, shelf-stable sources of collagen available. It has almost no flavor. It costs almost nothing.
And it addresses a physical vulnerability that most preparedness planning never even acknowledges. The second item is animal fat, lard, tallow, or duck fat. Here's a nutritional reality that modern diet culture has made us uncomfortable with. Fat is fuel. Not just fuel in the abstract sense, but the specific kind of slow-burning, sustained energy that the human body requires for physical labor, temperature regulation, and extended mental focus. Carbohydrates burn fast and spike hard. Fat burns slow and steady. When you are physically active in a cold environment, carrying loads or working through manual tasks for hours at a time, carbohydrate energy is not sufficient on its own. A pantry built purely on rice, beans, and pasta may look complete on paper, but it can leave the body running a quiet caloric deficit that manifests as bone-deep exhaustion, the kind that no amount of rest seems to fix. Adding high-quality animal fat to your storage changes the energy profile of your diet entirely. A tablespoon of lard stirred into beans, a spoonful of tallow used to cook rice. These are not indulgences. They are performance decisions. Now we come to the foundation layer, the items that address longevity, nutritional completeness, and the single most overlooked gap in almost every home pantry: whole wheat berries. Most people stock flour, and flour seems like a reasonable choice, but flour has a shelf life of somewhere between 6 and 12 months before the oils in the grain begin to oxidize and go rancid. Whole wheat berries stored correctly in a sealed container away from light and moisture can remain viable for decades. This is not a minor difference. This is the difference between a pantry that lasts through a short disruption and a pantry that provides genuine long-term food security. Combined with a simple hand-cranked grain mill, which is a modest investment that most preparedness budgets can accommodate, wheat berries give you the ability to produce flour on demand, without any dependency on the commercial supply chain. That shift is profound. It moves you from the position of waiting for a store to restock to the position of being a producer of food. That is real security, and it costs far less than most people assume. The second item in this layer is one that many people have actually replaced without realizing the consequences: iodized table salt. Over the past decade, there has been a significant cultural shift toward gourmet salts: Himalayan pink salt, sea salt, fleur de sel. These are wonderful products, and in normal daily life, the distinction barely matters. But here is the quiet gap. Most gourmet salts are not iodized, and in a restricted diet where seafood, dairy, and fortified processed foods are no longer available, iodine deficiency can develop with surprising speed. Iodine deficiency does not announce itself dramatically. It does not feel like starvation. It feels like sluggishness, sensitivity to cold, difficulty concentrating, and a kind of mental fog that is very easy to mistake for general stress or exhaustion. But it is your thyroid quietly failing to regulate your metabolism, and no amount of rest or food will fix it if the iodine is simply not there. A single box of standard iodized table salt is one of the cheapest, most indefinitely shelf-stable items you can add to your pantry. Keep it alongside whatever gourmet salts you prefer for flavor. It is a simple, cheap insurance policy against a deficiency that most people would never think to look for. And now the final item, the one most people walk straight past in the baking aisle without ever giving it a second glance: cream of tartar. Here's the scenario. You have flour, you have sugar, you have oil. You have everything you need for biscuits, pancakes, flatbreads, and simple baked goods. And then you realize you have no leavening agent, no baking powder, no active yeast. And without leavening, everything you bake stays flat and dense and heavy. Edible, technically, but nothing that feels like real food. When a disruption hits and store shelves empty out, baking powder and yeast are among the first things to disappear. What does not disappear, what almost never gets panic bought, is cream of tartar. When you combine cream of tartar with baking soda in the right ratio, you produce a perfectly functional homemade baking powder. It activates on contact with moisture and heat, and the result is bread that rises, biscuits that puff, and pancakes with actual texture. This is not a minor cooking convenience. In a long-term disruption, the smell of fresh bread rising in a pan, the sight of biscuits coming off the heat, the act of sitting down to something that resembles a real, normal meal, these things do more for the morale and psychological stability of a household than almost anything else you can prepare. Cream of tartar is small, inexpensive, and ignored by nearly everyone. It is the item that preserves the ability to make food that feels like home. Here's the principle that connects everything we've covered today. Real preparedness is not about how many calories you have stored. It's about how many of those calories stay functional when the world changes. It's about whether your pantry accounts for the human being who has to live inside the crisis, not just survive it. The person who still needs comfort, who still needs variety, who needs a body that works and a mind that holds together. The items most people store are a starting point. The items we talked about today are what turn that starting point into something that actually holds when the pressure is real. If this video gave you something useful, please give it a like. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are thinking seriously about this. Subscribe to Essential Pantry if you want to keep building your knowledge, and we'll see you in the next one.